Hi, class. Welcome back. On Monday, we discussed the historical ethics that traditionally guided human use of animals. And we also discussed how these historical ethics, both a social consensus ethic and an individual ethic built on good husbandry, short circuited. And so, as we are using a large number of animals in research contexts, it appears that we do need a standard to help guide a right behavior or guide how we're treating these animals in this context. So, we looked at one potential contender, which is Peter Singer's utilitarianism. And Singer's like, listen, we can utilize animals for research purposes, but we should apply the principle of utility. Do that which produces the greatest good for the greatest number. Today we will be looking at two other potential contenders before moving on Friday to talk about what's called the three pillars and the three R's and the standards currently that reign supreme in research contexts. So we'll be looking at Tom Regan's right-based approach today and Bernie Rollins' telos approach. If we have time, we will connect it to the three R's, but if not, we'll be discussing it on Friday. And then I'll be pointing you to a case study that provides interesting information and interesting points to discuss in the discussion. All right, so we talked about research contexts and how there was this traditional social consensus ethic or mandate against cruelty, and how this mandate does not hold or it short circuits in research contexts because researchers are not being intentionally cruel. Researchers often utilize animals for research purposes for a variety of laudable and important goals, such as trying to cure cancer or to develop a new vaccine or to develop a new treatment option, etc. Animals are key and pivotal in current medical research. Right? So this mandate against cruelty doesn't work and it doesn't help guide behavior in this context. So what should we replace this historical social consensus ethic with? Well, as we discussed, Peter Singer's like, psh, Jeremy Bentham's been talking about this for 200 years. Well, when he was alive, right? And yeah, let's just apply the principle of utility. So Singer was one of the first bioethicists and philosophers to argue that utilitarianism should reign supreme and that we do need another ethic in these contexts. Tom Regan, a few years after Peter Singer published his particular piece, is like, whoa, 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 whoa. Utilitarianism? Utilitarianism can be used to justify a whole host of problematic behavior. What we need is deontology. We need to pull from Kant. We need to look at rights. What about autonomy? Can't we apply autonomy to all beings that are being impacted? Yeah. So, as we'll see in this lecture, Tom Regan wants to push back against Peter Singer's utilitarianism and instead offer an alternative format. And as we'll see later, Bernie Rollin has problems with both of them. And he wrote after both Singer and Regan, and he's like, wow, we should look at the three pillars, right? Standard veterinary care. Is standard veterinary care being provided? Is bodily integrity being maintained? What about effective states? Are the animals, do they have enrichment opportunities, right? And what about the environment? Is the environment conducive to their natural behavior? Right? So we'll look at all three of these as potential contenders and potential replacements for this historical ethic. And today we'll be focusing on Regan, and we'll be dipping our toes and discussing, at least briefly, Bernie Rollin before diving into that on Friday. All right. So I believe I went over Singer quite a bit in the earlier 5 minutes of this lecture. But just to remember that he's adapting Jeremy Bentham's approach. If a being can suffer, it has an interest in avoiding suffering, and its interests should be treated equally to the similar interests of other beings. So here, interests are what matter, not the inherent value of the individual. And this is key for understanding Regan's concerns. So you can think of it like this. Singer thinks that what is ethically important are your interests and your experiences. Are you experiencing pleasure? Are you experiencing pain? And that is what is aggregated, right? To that which produces the greatest good, or in the case of Bentham, the greatest pleasure for the greatest number. So Singer doesn't necessarily see individuals as themselves as being ethically important. It's not the individual, it's their experiences that matter. Whereas Reagan is going to push back against this because Reagan is going to argue it's not the experiences that matter because everyone is an autonomous being and you can make choices about what you are going to do with your life. And sometimes those choices lead to pain, right? In addition to leading to pleasure. But what's important is to respect the person. Or, and Reagan will argue we need to extend this to animals as well, to respect the individual and their decision-making capacity, irrespective of irrespective of the experiences that this has brought about. So right away, you can see just with the basic assumptions built into Singer's position, how it's going to come into conflict with Reagan. For Singer, it doesn't matter. It's all about pleasure and pain. And honestly, for Singer, if the sacrifice of one brings forth the greatest good or the greatest pleasure for the greatest number, or in the case of Mill, the greatest good for the greatest number, depending on how we want to cash out what we're focusing on, Singer would argue that it's acceptable to sacrifice the one for the many. Whereas Reagan would argue that it is not because each person is individually valuable. Right? So I just want to highlight some of the assumptions that are guiding both of these positions that lead to very clear-cut conflicts when we apply them in the animal research context. Now, one of the things that both of these positions hold, though, Singer argues that animals should be placed in the ethical sphere, that we should include them in our utilitarian calculus. And as we'll see, Reagan does the same. And remember, for Singer on animal experimentation, there will be cases where animal testing is justified, provided that, and he's very clear-cut to identify these three criteria. There are no other ways to obtain the information. The welfare of the animal is taken into account to limit suffering, because remember, you want to maximize that pleasure, minimize the pain, and the suffering is outweighed by the long-term benefits that are provided. Right? So if these three criteria are justified or are met for Singer, then for Singer, animal testing is justified and should go forward. So here are some discussion questions that you could talk about on the discussion forum today. Do you agree with Singer's definition of persons? Like, should we expand persons to include non-human animals as well? Why or why not? Is the definition problematic? Especially in the healthcare sphere, where we have a history of having to protect the individual rights of persons, right? Is it unacceptable to give less weight to other species' interests? Speciesism, why or why not? Right? Should we be prioritizing? Is it a problem to prioritize, the well-being and the flourishing of humans over other species? Right? Singer would argue no. Well, Singer would argue yes, it is highly unacceptable. In fact, it's speciesism, right? But what do you think? Should suffering be the locus of ethical import? Should we focus on mental states, or should we focus on the inherent worth of the individual? And do you agree with Singer's position concerning animal testing? All these are good questions that you can discuss in the discussion forums. And I am interested in hearing what you think about Singer's position. Now, Reagan wants to push back against Singer's position. And in fact, when Singer published his piece, Reagan was quite well known for actively and vocally criticizing applying utilitarianism in animal research contexts. And Reagan's like, no, this is the wrong way to go. This does not do the work we wanted to do. It does not protect animals in a robust manner. We should not adopt Singer's position. Reagan's like, and I wanted to get popcorn and watch these two, Like on the one side of the ring, there's Singer. On the other side of the ring, there's Reagan yet again, right? And he's like, utilitarianism is interesting for several things, but it's not good here. And what we really need is to apply a rights-based approach rather than utilitarianism. He argues that philosophers have extended the idea of moral rights beyond humans, arguing that animals also have moral rights. So why don't we build a ethical framework to guide animal use on this rights-based approach, right? Now, before we look at Reagan's rights approach, I do want to make two distinctions. There are two senses of rights typically: legal and moral rights. Legal rights, akin to the social consensus ethic when they're encoded in law, are rights that are created and exist within legal systems. So I have a right, for example, to my garden. And this is protected by legal rights. There is an ethical or normative component as well, mandates against stealing and whatnot. But their legal rights are typically contingent on legal systems. And if legal codes and laws, etc., are changed, so change our legal rights as well. Right? Moral rights are distinct from legal rights, although confusingly, they can be encoded in legal systems. There's like a Venn diagram where there's overlap with legal rights and moral rights, and legal rights in the one sphere, moral rights in the other sphere, and then there can be some overlap there. Moral rights were not created by the law. And remember, he's pulling from Kant here. Remember, Kant argues that there are moral laws and and this is where moral rights come from, that exist irrespective of the individual context, and they're more akin to natural laws, right? So these are not created by the law. They're rights that stem from the inherent value of a being, right? So we have our legal system. These rights change over time, but we have these moral rights, and these moral rights are writ large, and they apply or guide behavior irrespective of the current legal system. Right? So remember that little snippet of Double Jeopardy. It's wrong to murder someone, even if, in the case of the Double Jeopardy movie, she was already tried for killing her husband once, and because she already served the time, she's like, I could kill you in the middle of Mardi Gras. Nobody would bat an eye because you can't be tried twice. But as the other character of Morgan, who played by Morgan Freeman, argued, it's still murder, and it is still ethically and morally wrong. So I urge you to watch that movie if you are interested in 80s and early 90s movies and Ashley Judd and Morgan Freeman. Good movie. But anyway, there's this distinction that's clearly in play there between legal and moral rights. So moral rights can't be traded. They can't be factored into calculations. You recognize the moral rights, that's it. Like the right to autonomy, the right to self-guided behavior. Remember, he's pulling from Kant. And they cannot be replaced. You can't say, oh, well, that moral right is tedious. Let's just replace it with this other one. So they're absolute, according to Reagan. So when you use moral rights language, you need to remember that it carries special force, right? To say that a being has moral rights is to make a very strong claim that those rights need to be protected and promoted. I have a right to make decisions in my life. That's a very strong statement. I have a right to major in whatever I want to major in. I have a right to health care. That would be a huge statement. I have a right to health care. I have a right to a fair trial, right? I have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was a huge statement, So you can think of rights language as an ace in the pocket, so to speak. You are making a very clear and very profound statement concerning moral rights, which are absolute, and they carry special force in our society. The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So rights-based approaches, these are not based on consequences, and here, again, it's pushing back against Singer. It's based upon the recognition of these universal moral rights. And Reagan argues that if we build a foundation to guide animal usage, um, utilizing rights language, then we will have a very different outcome than Singer came to utilizing utilitarianism. And Reagan argues that all experiencing subjects of a life should be thought as possessing moral rights, experiencing subjects of a life. Now, what the heck does that mean? Oh, and a side note, if you recognize that someone has rights, I have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or I have a right to health care, etc., that also entails duties to provide to see that said rights are met. So there's this interplay here in rights approaches between rights and duties. So experiencing subjects of a life. What the heck? Experiencing subjects of a life, What does he mean by that? Well, he argues that an experiencing subject of a life is a conscious creature having an individual welfare that has importance, whatever its usefulness to others, regardless of whether or not you increase the overall utility, regardless of whether or not you're acting in a way that benefits a society. You have usefulness in and of yourself. Remember, this is hearkening back to Kant, right? You are valuable because you are a rational person who can guide your behavior utilizing reason. You can make choices, and these choices impact not only your life, but the life of others. And that in itself is an important component. That is a valuable capability, right? And in a similar way, Reagan wants to argue that we should extend this right, this concept of individual rights beyond humans. And we should argue that conscious creatures have this, whatever their usefulness to others. But which conscious creatures? I mean, are we talking about all conscious creatures? Are we talking about a few conscious creatures? I mean, are we just going to, place even ecosystems, communities of animals, everything from the snail to the bonobo? Do they all go in the moral sphere? What's Reagan talking about here? He argues, whoa. He's like, there are some criteria that need to be met to be a subject of a life, to be placed in the ethical calculus, so to speak. Well, ethical calculus is not the right word. To be placed in the ethical sphere. He argues, well, to be a subject of a life, to be seen as important, whatever your usefulness to others, you need to undergo pleasure and pain, be able to undergo pleasure and pain, experience satisfaction. You're satisfied in one choice and dissatisfied in another, and have a sense of self. Right? You need to recognize not that you are making decisions. And this is what Hegel calls, actually, the will that wills. The will is just someone who does something. You will something to be, but you don't know that you will something. The will that wills recognizes that you're willing something. So you can also think of it as second order thought. Right? So if you undergo pleasure and pain, if you experience satisfaction, and if you have a sense of self, then for Reagan, you should be seen as a subject of a life, right? And you should be placed in the ethical sphere. Importantly, if you don't meet the criteria here for Reagan to be a subject of a life, ethics don't apply to you, right? And that's important, right? Especially when we're talking about research concerning fish. Fish do not meet Reagan's criteria. Fish do not fall within his ethical purview. So we have this, you are a subject of a life and you are not a subject of a life line here. And he argues that, well, what creatures possess it? For Reagan, he argues that all mentally normal adult mammals fall into this category. And thus they have basic moral rights, including the right to life and liberty. And so recognizing that they have importance, irrespective of their usefulness to others, means that they should not be used as instruments for someone else's use and benefit. And remember, I mentioned earlier that Reagan's approach is the most stringent of the three. And we can think of them as on the linear scale of animal research and using animals for research. Reagan's over in the almost abolitionist camp, whereas Peter Singer's in the middle. Yeah, we can use some animals for research sometimes. It all depends on the context, right? And if it brings about the greatest good. And as we'll see, Rollin argues that animals can be used for research, but we need to have welfare standards in place. Yeah, so Reagan, in his very clear-cut approach, they're not instruments for someone else's use and benefit. So if you use rights-based approach, it brings us to a radically different view than Singer. So for example, Top Hat Kitten likes to go outside while wearing a hat, and the kitten is adorable. And Reagan would argue that she has a right to live her life in the way that she wants to, which includes being able to go outside in a top hat if she feels like it. Thus, she deserves ethical treatment. She deserves the ability. We need to respect her ability to do so, and this entails that duty of respect, even if it goes against my interests in keeping her safe. So, part of recognizing another being as a subject of a life is recognizing that they have a right to guide their life the way that they see fit. And remember, if we're including animals in this context, self-directed behavior, we need to respect the autonomy of the animals. And just a note, Kant argued very clearly that autonomy should only be recognized concerning human animals. Reagan is arguing that all subjects of a life should essentially have their autonomy recognized. So if this is the case, then most of the ways that we utilize animals then become highly problematic. And for this reason, we can think of the rights view as categorically abolitionist. If we accept this position or this contender as a replacement for the mandate against cruelty, the social consensus ethic, then it would mean no animal testing, no industrial agriculture, and even pet ownership is problematic. Reagan has an interesting piece where he argues that spaying and neutering your pets actually violates their reproductive rights, and as such, it's highly problematic. So the fact that I spayed my dog would be seen Reagan would call me out on that. It would be seen as an unethical act on my part, just to give an example. And you can see this, how categorically abolitionist it is in some of the quotes that we pull from his text. Lab animals are not our tasters. We are not their kings. Because these animals are treated routinely, systematically, as if their value were reducible to their usefulness to others, they are routinely, systematically treated with lack of respect, and thus are their rights routinely, systematically violated. Listen to that language. Lab animals are not our tasters. We are not their kings. It's incredibly strong ethical mandates, pointing back to the previous slide where we could think of rights language as holding special force, And another quote, as for commercial animal agriculture, the fundamental moral wrong here is the systematic wrong that allows these animals to be viewed and treated as lacking independent value, as resources for us, and as indeed a renewable resource, end quote. So in this second quote, he's very clearly arguing that these animals are subjects of a life, and as such, they have inherent value. And the main issue for him then with industrial agriculture is this lack of recognition of the inherent value of the animals within the agricultural systems. So Reagan is taking a very clear-cut stand against many of the ways that we utilize animals in our everyday experiences. And he's pushing us to rethink what ethical or right behavior is, or right treatment is, of the animals that we have in our everyday lives, from the animals in laboratory contexts all the way up to my dog, Turtle, Tortuga, and in my living room, who is looking at me right now. And in this way, you can think of Reagan's ethic as valuable in that it does push us to reconsider and to think about the way that we treat animals. Now it's about 26 minutes, so I'm just going to point to Bernie Rollin, but I'm going to cover Bernie Rollin's ethic on Friday. So Bernie Rollin has a problem with both Peter Singer and Tom Regan. And he argues that Peter Singer's utilitarianism is problematic for many reasons, but it's problematic primarily because it's not focused on the right things. It's not focused on a species typical behavior and respecting species typical behavior, and it's not focusing on ensuring animal welfare. And similarly, Rollin also is highly critical of Reagan. And Reagan's argument for Rollin is wrongheaded. That Rollin argues that we've been utilizing animals for thousands of years. And in fact, we co-evolved with several species of animals from dogs to cows to pigs. And we have a symbiotic relationship with domesticated animals that live with us. And as such, this relationship needs to be the foundation or the basis for determining right action. Right? So if utilitarianism is not going to work, is not recognizing this special relationship that we have to non-human animals, and if the rights-based approach is not recognizing this special relationship that we have, well, what other ethical framework can we utilize to form the foundation for a new ethic? And Rollin argues that, well, let's go back to the Greeks. We talked about virtue theory, we talked about Epicurus and whatnot. The Greeks had some pretty good ideas. What about telos? So Bernie Rollin's built a third contender on this respect for telos. And respect for telos roughly goes as follows. This maxim is roughly that if we have dealings with animals, we need to respect their needs and desires. So you can think of the telos of an animal as the needs and desires that stem from its nature. So the telos, for example, of a knife is to cut well. Right? The telos of an acorn is to grow into an oak tree. It's part of the acorn's nature to grow and develop in specific ways so that it eventually becomes an oak tree. And that's a rough and ready rule of thumb to recognize the natural desires and needs that stem from a being's nature. So what would the telos of a chicken be, like in an aviary? Well, it would be to roost, to lay eggs, and to make nests, to peck, all of these things. So we can think of these natural capacities and natural needs and desires of animals, and that for Rollin, just as a spoiler alert for Friday, is what we should be focusing on when we're thinking about right action in research contexts. We should be focusing on respecting the basic needs and desires of the animals. So, spoiler alert for the third, we looked at Peter Singer as a potential replacement. We looked at Tom Reagan's rights-based approach as a potential replacement for this historical ethic. And on Friday, we will dig deeply into Bernie Rollin's argument concerning respect for telos. So as it's already, I've been talking with you for already 30 minutes, and I don't want to bog you down with incredibly long lectures. I'm going to leave it here, and we are going to pick this up on Friday. And I am